Mm,
I think their servers might be a little overloaded. We can start and it will stream it, but
well,
YouTube has its issues right now.
should we start reading? Are you like a hundo piece casting? Big
Yes.
time a week ago, or I was
Yeah,
like,
it
it's not
it
live,
literally
and you,
is
oh, it's
starting
there!
right
Oh
now.
my god!
It's coming up.
Okay.
So, hi
Oh my god!
everybody.
Thank God.
You'll
Okay.
be seeing this
Okay.
in a moment. Maybe a couple of moments, but we are socially distanced reading. I'm Robert Hansen. This is Lily Tanner, and we are going to be reading chapters 11 and 12 of the Phantom Tollbooth this evening. Were you going to add something? Hey, the internet crashed Lily.
Yeah. Let's. It crashed you as well. Let's reprise our Muppet Show thing.
Ah,
It's
okay.
the Phantom Tollbooth show
Hello,
with our
everybody, and welcome
special
to the
guest
Phantom
star,
Tollbooth Show.
Greg. Woo! Okay.
Yay!
Oh, let's read. Robert, you're narrating. Have fun.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to chapter 11, Discord and Din. One by one the hours passed, and exactly 5:22, by Talk's very accurate clock, what a good boy, Milo carefully opened one eye and, in a moment, the other. Everything was still purple, dark blue, and black, yet scarcely a minute remained to the long quiet night. He stretched lazily, rubbed his eyelids, scratched his head, and shivered once as a greeting to the early morning mist. "I must wake Chroma for the sunrise," he said softly. Then he suddenly wondered what it would be like to lead the orchestra and to color the whole world himself. The idea whirled through his thoughts until he quickly decided that since it couldn't be very difficult, and since they probably all knew what to do by themselves anyway, and since it did seem a shame to wake anyone so early, and since it might be his only chance to try, and since the musicians were already poised and ready, he would. But just for a little while. And so, as everyone slept peacefully on, Milo stood on tiptoes, raised his arms slowly in front of him, and made the slightest movement possible with the index finger of his right hand. It was now 5:23 a.m. As if understanding his signal perfectly, a single piccolo played a single note, and off in the east a solitary shaft of cool lemon light flickered across the sky. Milo smiled happily, and then cautiously crooked his finger again. This time, two more piccolos and a flute joined in, and three more rays of light danced lightly into view. Then, with both hands, he made a great circular sweep in the air and watched with delight as all the musicians began to play at once. The cellos made the hills glow red, and the leaves and grass were tipped with a soft pale green as the violins began their song. Only the bass fiddles rested as the entire orchestra washed the forest in color. Milo was overjoyed because they were all playing for him, and just the way they should. "Won't Chroma be surprised?" he thought, signaling the musicians to stop. "I'll wake him up now." But, instead of stopping, they continued to play even louder than before until each color became more brilliant than he thought possible. Milo shielded his eyes with one hand and waved the other desperately, but the colors continued to grow brighter and brighter and brighter until an even more curious thing began to happen. As Milo frantically conducted, the sky changed slowly from blue to tan and then to a rich magenta red. Flurries of light green snow began to fall, and the leaves on the trees and bushes turned a vivid orange. All the flowers suddenly appeared black, the gray rocks became a lovely soft chartreuse, and even peacefully sleeping Talk changed from brown to a magnificent ultramarine. Nothing was the color it should have been, and yet the more he tried to straighten things out, the worse they became. "I wish I hadn't started," he thought unhappily as a pale blue blackbird flew by. "There doesn't seem to be any way to stop them." He tried very hard to do everything just the way Chroma had done, but nothing worked. The musicians played on faster and faster, and the purple sun raced quickly across the sky. In less than a minute it had set once more in the west, and then, without any pause, risen again in the east. The sky was now quite yellow, and the grass a charming shade of lavender. 7 times the sun rose and almost as quickly disappeared as the colors kept changing. In just a few minutes, a whole week had gone by. At last, the exhausted Milo, afraid to call for help and on the verge of tears, dropped his hands to his side. The orchestra stopped. The colors disappeared, and once again it was night. The time was 5:27 a.m. "Wake up, everybody! Time for the sunrise!" he shouted with relief, and quickly jumped from the music stand. "What a marvelous rest!" said Chroma, striding to the podium. "I feel as though I'd slept for a week. My, I see we're a little late this morning. I'll have to cut my lunch hour short by 4 minutes." He tapped for attention, and this time the dawn proceeded perfectly. "You did a fine job," he said, patting Milo on the head. "Someday I'll let you conduct the orchestra yourself." Talk wagged his tail proudly, but Milo didn't say a word, and to this day, no one knows of the lost week but the few people who happened to be awake at 5:23 on that very strange morning.
We'd better be getting along.
Said Talk, whose alarm had begun to ring again.
Ring! For there's still a long way to go.
Chroma nodded a fond goodbye as they all started back through the forest, and in honor of the visit he made all the wildflowers bloom in a breathtaking display.
I'm sorry, you can't stay longer.
Said Alex sadly.
There's so much more to see in the forest of sight. But I suppose there's a lot to see everywhere if you only keep your eyes open.
They walked for a while, all silent in their thoughts, until they reached the car, and Alec drew a fine telescope from his shirt and handed it to Milo.
Carry this with you on your journey,
He said softly.
for there is much worth noticing that often escapes the eye. Through it, you can see everything from the tender moss in a sidewalk crack to the glow of the forest star. And most important of all, you can see things just as they really are, not just as they seem to be. It's my gift to you.
Milo placed the telescope carefully in the glove compartment and reached up to shake Alec by the hand. Then he stepped on the starter and, with his head full of strange new thoughts, drove out the far end of the forest. The easy rolling countryside now stretched before them in a series of dips and rises that leapt up one side of each crest and slid gently down the other in a way that made stomachs laugh and faces frown. As they topped the brow of the highest hill, a deep valley appeared ahead. The road, finally making up its mind, plummeted down, as if anxious to renew acquaintance with the sparkling blue stream that flowed below. When they reached the floor of the valley, the wind grew stronger as it funneled rocks, and directly ahead a bright-colored speck grew larger and larger. "It looks like a wagon!" cried Milo excitedly.
It is a wagon, a carnival wagon.
Seconded Talk, and that's exactly what it was. Parked at the side of the road, painted bright red, and looking quite deserted. On its side, in enormous white letters, bordered in black, was the inscription, Cacophonous,
Cacophonous. A discord.
and below, in smaller black letters, bordered in white, was
conductor of dissonance.
Perhaps if someone's at home, he might tell us how far we have to go, said Milo, parking next to the wagon. He tiptoed timidly up the 3 wooden steps to the door, tapped lightly, and leapt back in fright, for the moment he knocked there was a terrible crash from inside the wagon that sounded as if a whole set of dishes had been dropped from the ceiling onto a hard stone floor. At the same time, the door flew open, and from the dark interior a hoarse voice inquired,
Have you ever heard a whole set of dishes dropped from the ceiling onto a hard stone floor?
Milo, who had tumbled back off the step, sat up quickly, while Talk and the humbug rushed from the car to see what had happened.
Well, have you?
Insisted the voice, which was so raspy that it made you want to clear your own throat. Not until just now, replied Milo, getting to his feet.
Ha! I thought not.
Said the voice happily.
Have you ever heard an ant wearing a zip?
Have you ever heard an ant wearing
And
fur
before they
slippers
could
walk
answer,
across
he
a
went
thick
on in
wool
his
carpet?
strange
And before they could answer, he went on in his strange croaking
and
way.
before they could answer, he went on. Well, don't just stand there in the cold. Come in, come in. It's lucky you happened by. None of you looks well.
The faint glow of a ceiling lamp dimly illuminated the wagon as they cautiously stepped inside. Talk first, eager to defend against all dangers, Milo next, frightened but curious, and the humbug last, ready at any moment to run for his life.
That's right. Now have a look at you.
He said.
Very bad, very bad. A serious case.
The dusty wagon was lined with shelves full of curious boxes and jars of a kind found in old apothecary shops. It looked as though it hadn't been swept out in years. Bits and pieces of equipment lay strewn all over the floor, and at the rear end was a heavy wooden table covered with books, bottles, and bric-a-brac.
Have you ever heard a blindfolded octopus unwrap a cellophane-covered bathtub?
He inquired again as the air was filled with a loud, crinkling, snapping sound. Sitting at the table, busily mixing and measuring, was the man who had invited them in. He was wearing a long white coat with a stethoscope around his neck and a small round mirror attached to his forehead, and the only really noticeable things about him were his tiny mustache and his enormous ears, each of which was fully as large as his head. Are you a doctor? Asked Milo, trying to feel as well as possible.
I am cacophonous, a discord, doctor of dissonance.
Roared the man, and as he spoke, several small explosions and a grinding crash were heard. What does the A stand for? Stammered the nervous bug, too frightened to move.
As loud as possible.
Bellowed the doctor, and 2 screeches and a bump accompanied his response.
Now step a little closer and stick out your tongues. Just as I suspected.
He continued, opening a large dusty book and thumbing through the pages.
You're suffering from a severe lack of noise.
He began to jump around the wagon, snatching bottles from the shelves until he had a large assortment in various colors and sizes collected at one end of the table. All were neatly labeled, Loud cries, soft cries, bangs, bongs, smashes, crashes, swishes, swooshes, snaps and crackles, whistles and gongs, squeaks, squawks, and miscellaneous uproar. After pouring a little of each into a large glass beaker, he stirred the mixture thoroughly with a wooden spoon, watching intently as it smoked and steamed and boiled and bubbled.
Be ready in just a moment.
He explained, rubbing his hands. Milo had never seen such unpleasant looking medicine and wasn't at all anxious to try any. Just what kind of a doctor are you? He asked suspiciously.
Well, you might say I'm a specialist.
Said the doctor.
I specialize in noise, all kinds, from the loudest to the softest, from the terribly annoying to the terribly unpleasant. For instance, have you ever heard a scover field steam roller ride over a street full of hard boiled eggs?
He asked, and as he did, all that could be heard were loud crunching sounds. But who would want all those terrible noises? Asked Milo, holding his ears.
Everybody does.
Said the surprised doctor.
They're very popular today. Why, I'm kept so busy I can hardly feel the orders for noise pills, racket lotion, clamor salve, and hubbub tonic. That's all people seem to want these days.
He stirred the beaker of liquid a few more times, and then, as the stream cleared, continued.
Business wasn't always so good. Years ago, everyone wanted pleasant sounds, and except for a few orders during wars and earthquakes, things were very bad. But then the big cities were built, and there was a great need for honking horns, screeching trains, clanging bells, deafening shouts, piercing shrieks, gurgling drains, and all the rest of those wonderfully unpleasant sounds we use so much of today. Without them, people would be very unhappy. And so I make sure that they get as much as they want. Why, if you take a little of my medicine every day, you'll never have to hear a beautiful sound again. Here, try some.
If it's all the same to you, I'd rather not, said the humbug, backing away to the far corner of the wagon. I don't want to be cured of beautiful sounds, insisted Milo.
Besides,
Growled Talk, who decided that he didn't much like Dr. Discord.
there is no such illness as a lack of noise. Of course not.
Replied the doctor, pouring himself a small glass of the liquid.
That's what makes it so difficult to cure. I only treat illnesses that don't exist. That way, if I can't cure them, there's no harm done. Just one of the precautions of the trade.
He concluded, and seeing that no one was about to take his medicine, he reached toward the shelf, removed a dark amber bottle, dusted it carefully, and placed it on the table in front of him.
Very well. If you want to go through all life suffering from a noise deficiency, I'll give it all to the Din for his lunch.
He said, and he uncorked the bottle with a hollow sounding pop. For a moment, everything was quiet as Milo, Talk, and the humbug looked intently at the bottle, wondering what Dr. Discord would do next. Then, very faintly at first, they heard a low rumbling that sounded miles away. It grew louder and louder and louder, and closer and closer and closer, till it became a deafening, ear-splitting roar that seemed to be coming from inside the tiny bottle. Then, from the bottle, a thick bluish smog spiraled to the ceiling, spread out, and gradually assumed the shape of a thick, bluish smog with hands, bright yellow eyes, and a large, frowning mouth. As soon as the smog had gotten completely out of the bottle, it grasped the beaker of liquid, tilted back what would have been its head, if it really had one, and drank it all in 3 gulps. Ah, that was good, master, he bellowed, shaking the whole wagon. I thought you'd never let me out. Terribly cramped in there,
This is my assistant, the awful Dean.
said Dr. Discord.
You must forgive his appearance, for he really doesn't have any. You see, he is an whom I raised myself without benefit of governess or any other assistance for.
No nurse is good nurse, interrupted the din, doubling up with laughter. If you can imagine a thick bluish smog doubling up with laughter,
For I found him
continued the doctor, ignoring this outburst.
living alone and unwanted in an abandoned soda bottle, without family or relatives.
No niece is good niece, roared the din again, with a laugh that sounded like several sirens going off at once, and he slapped at where his knee should have been.
And brought him here
Continued the exasperated discord.
where, despite his lack of shape or features, I trained him.
No nose is good nose, thundered the din once again as he collapsed in another fit of hysterics and clutched his sides.
I trained him as my assistant in the business of concocting and dispensing noise.
Finished the doctor, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. No noise is good noise, exclaimed the humbug, happily trying to catch the spirit of things. That's not funny at all, sobbed the din, who went to a corner and sulked. What is a din? Asked Milo when he had recovered from the shock of seeing him appear.
You mean you've never met the awful Din before?
Said Dr. Discord in a surprised tone.
Why, I thought everyone had. When you're playing in your room and make a great amount of noise, what do they tell you to stop?
That awful din, admitted Milo.
When the neighbors are playing their radio too loud late at night, what do you wish they'd turn down? That awful Din.
Answered Talk.
When the street on your block is being repaired and the pneumatic drills are working all day, what does everyone complain of?
The dreadful row, volunteered the humbug brightly. Oh my.
You're doing great.
My apologies, everyone. I have hit the spacebar on accident.
You're doing great. While you figure this out, I'll let everyone know Robert made a very good observation about this character. His name is the Din, and he's kept inside a bottle like a djinn from ancient Middle Eastern mythology. So that's very fun to just think about. Here we have him represented as Babar, slightly different, but I think it's still pretty good. Also, every day I think I know how many stuffed animals Robert has, but then he humbug just said the dreadful row. And then
Row, volunteered the humbug brightly. The dreadful row, cried the anguished din, was my grandfather. He perished in the great silence epidemic of 1712. Milo felt so sorry for the unhappy din that he gave him his handkerchief, which was immediately covered in bluish, smoggy tears. Thank you, groaned the din.
That's very kind, but I certainly can't understand why you don't like noise,
he said.
Why, I heard an explosion last week, and that was so lovely I cried for 2 days.
The very thought of it upset him so much that he began to sob all over again in a way that sounded almost exactly like a handful of fingernails being scratched across a mile-long blackboard. He buried his head in the doctor's lap. "He's very sensitive, isn't he?" asked Milo, trying to comfort the emotional Din.
It's true.
Agreed Dr. Discord.
But he's right, for noise is the most valuable thing in the world.
"King Azy says words are," said Milo.
Nonsense!
The doctor roared.
Why, when a baby wants food, how does he ask?
He screams!
Answered the Din, looking up happily.
And when an automobile wants gas?
It chokes!
He shouted again, jumping for joy.
When a river wants water, what does it do?
It creaks!
Bellowed the Din as he collapsed into a fit of uncontrolled laughter.
And what happens when a new day begins?
It breaks!
He gasped joyfully from the floor, a look of utter bliss covering his face.
You see how simple it is.
The doctor said to Milo, who didn't see at all. And then, turning to the tear-stained, smiling Din, he remarked,
Isn't it time for you to go?
"Where to?" asked Milo. "Perhaps we're going the same way."
I think not,
The Din replied, picking up an armful of empty sacks from the
I
table.
for I'm going on my noise collection rounds. You see, once a day, I travel throughout the kingdom and collect all the wonderfully horrible and beautifully unpleasant noises that have been made, pack them into my sack, and bring them back here for the doctor to make his medicines from.
And a good job he does.
Said Dr. Discord, pounding his fist on the table.
So wherever the noise is, that's where you'll find me,
Said the Din with an appreciative smile.
and I must hurry along, for I understand that today there's to be a screech, several loud crashes, and a bit of pandemonium.
And in which direction are you going?
Asked the doctor, mixing another brew. "Topolis," replied Milo.
How unfortunate,
He
How
said.
unfortunate.
He said as the Din shuffled toward the door.
Go on.
It's
How very unfortunate, for then you must pass through the valley of sound.
"Is that bad?" asked the perpetually worried humbug. The Din paused in the doorway with a look of extreme horror on his almost featureless face, and the doctor shuddered in a way that sounded very much like a fast-moving freight train being derailed into a mountain of custard.
Well, you might ask, for you will find out soon enough.
Was all he would say as he sadly bade them farewell, and the Din galloped off on his rounds. Wow, you guys, it's chapter 12. The Silent Valley.
Oh my god. Ooh, do you think there's ranch there? There is in the Hidden Valley.
Okay. Um, how agreeable and pleasant this valley is, thought Milo, as once again they bounced along the highway with the humbug humming snatches of old songs to his own vast amusement, and Talk sniffing contentedly at the wind. I really can't see what Dr. Discord was so concerned about. There certainly couldn't be anything unpleasant along this road. And just as the thought crossed his mind, they passed through a heavy stone gateway, and everything was very different. At first, it was difficult to tell just what had changed. It all looked the same, and it all smelled the same, but for some reason, and it all smelled the same, but for some reason, nothing sounded the same. I wonder what's happened, said Milo. At least that's what he tried to say, for although his lips moved, not a sound came from his mouth. And suddenly he realized what it was, for Talk was no longer ticking, and the humbug, although happily singing, was doing so in complete silence. The wind no longer rustled the leaves, the car no longer squeaked, and the insects no longer buzzed in the fields. Not the slightest thing could be heard, and it felt as if, in some mysterious way, a switch had been thrown, and all the sound in the world had been turned off at the same instant. The humbug, suddenly realizing what had happened, leapt to his feet in terror, and Talk worriedly checked to see if he was still keeping the time. It was certainly a strange feeling to know that no matter how loudly or softly you chatted or rattled or bumped, it all came out the same way, as nothing. How dreadful, thought Milo as he slowed down the car. The three of them began to talk and shout at once with absolutely no result until, hardly noticing where they were going, they had driven into the midst of a large crowd of people marching along the road. Some of them were singing at the tops of their non existent voices, and the others were carrying large